I just feel like we are surrounded in this world by bullshit.
So how can you know what's real and what's not? Science versus. That's how. We answer questions like, does anti-aging skincare actually work? And what is your true personality type? And to answer these questions, we don't use opinions. We dive into the scientific studies, talk to the experts, and put it in a podcast that I know you are gonna love. Listen to Science Versus on Spotify.
The views, assumptions, and opinions expressed by the Godfather hosts, guests, and callers on the program are strictly their own and do not necessarily represent the opinions or beliefs of Electricast Media.
What they are able to see is that Hamas has brought a catastrophe upon the Palestinian people of Gaza. The assumption that the Gazans themselves are benighted children who cannot understand cause and effect is in itself a sort of a racism of reduced expectations. I believe that once the full implications of what Hamas did on the 7th of October are brought to bear, I think there will be young people coming up saying we need a very different perspective, a very different approach.
Welcome to the Godfather Wars, the real talk on understanding how geopolitics impacts you and your world. We're your hosts,
Barak Sina.
And I'm Leah Tedrow. Thank you for joining us as we take a deep dive behind the topics affecting the world we live in today. Welcome back to the show where we'll be discussing the war in Israel in a 4-part series. Today, we continue with part 3, mainstream radicalization in our series. Later in the show, we'll be joined by our special guest, former Colonel Reserve, Dr. Eran Lerman, former Deputy Director for Foreign Policy and International Affairs at the Israeli National Security Council and Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, as he discusses the Islamist dimension to the conflict, how mainstream radicalization affects the day after in Gaza. Our usual segments of what this means to you and Who's Who in The Godfather, where Barak will discuss which countries are emulating the traits of characters from the Godfather movie, will follow. So with that, Barak, how have you been? It's been a while.
It has been a while. So you've been away, I've been away.
There's been a lot of stuff happening in the world in that time span.
It just feels like that when you take a break and you try to relax, unwind, it feels in a sense artificial knowing that there's so many tensions going on in the world and people suffering at the same time, but you need to do it for your own sanity.
Yeah, it's true. It's important to have the sort of balance, and it's important to just have a sanity break for yourself, I think. Although I think in your household with your 2 little ones, there's no such thing as a sanity break.
Well, your grueling exercise, share with everyone about what you've recently achieved. It would have pushed me over the edge.
Yeah. So I think Barak is referring to, we just completed the Ride for Unity 7 days, 7 Emirates cycle tour, where a group of business leader, Paralympics, professional athletes went on a 7-day tour of the UAE. We did 437 kilometers, I think was the total mileage, but we were stopping in every single emirate and doing things like understanding coral conservation in Fujairah. We visited the Wells Spring School and American University in Ras Al Khaimah. We went to Census School for Special Needs and Residential Daycare Center, the Ajman National Charity School, the mangroves. We planted some mangroves as part of our sustainability, the American University Dubai, and we cycled on Kite Beach with Children of Determination, and then kind of rounded out our tour in Abu Dhabi. So it was an incredible week, very life-changing, very moving, very touching, and I think a good reminder of what's important. But with all the cycling in between that, it's I'm in a week recovery now. But it was amazing. It was really good, and it does help put things in perspective, I think, and then show just how it doesn't matter where you come from, what your background is, whatever, different struggles you may be having. We all have so much more in common, and, just the power of one person and, spreading that kind of message of unity, diversity, tolerance, and sustainability, that we can make a difference. And,
I think, Leah, not only would the cycling have pushed me over the edge, all that positivity as well. I wouldn't have been able to have coped.
You are like Schleprock, though, from the Stones. Do you know what I mean? You just have this dark cloud around your head everywhere you go.
Just Give me misery and
I
I'm
know,
okay.
I know.
Maybe that's why I'm into geopolitics, because things always sort of spin off from bad to worse.
Long story short, it was an amazing week. And it was really good to see all the community coming out to support us. It was amazing. But then I had to come back to the real world and the far, greater grim realities of what we're actually dealing with, the conflict in Israel, and things are not really looking better. And we've got a pretty amazing segment today with our special guest, Dr. Lerman, who's going to be talking about mainstream radicalization. But I just kind of wanted to go through, kind of set the tone for the people that are listening about what we mean by radicalization and what that is, and go through the numbers and really just kind of put this in context, because I don't want people to think that there's one side or another, but we actually do need to talk about one glaring issue in this conflict, which is radicalization of the mainstream population in the Palestinian territories and how that is affecting things and how that is actually affecting and preventing useful dialogue coming together and creating resolutions and stymieing a peaceful resolution to this. And so I think that's important, that is one of the major obstacles that lies in the way and ahead. And, this leads us into, Gaza the day after, but this is a major obstacle and we need to talk about the context that it sits in and, what we actually need to do to address that radicalization. And if we can bring what we call in the strategic communications world, the irredeemables back, which, there's always going to be a population which you can't. But I think there are people that sit in the middle and are part of that ideology because they don't have a choice and because they're trying to survive. And I think that's where that messaging is probably going to have the most effectiveness. But
I'll debate with you about the number of people, the percentage that actually sit in the middle. But one of the reasons why it's really important to look at this sort of dark reality is because it offers policymakers a sobering look at reality. Because if policymakers ignore this, if they overlook it, then they risk offering the false prescriptions to the situation, which risks inflaming the situation more. So Birzeit University has a section called the Arab World for Research and Development. And on November the 14th, when they asked a leading question, how much do you support the military operation carried out by the Palestinian resistance led by Hamas on October the 7th? Now, despite them being aware of the horrific atrocities that took place, the overall majority of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip supported the attack. A mass of 63.6% said they supported the attack extremely or to a somewhat extent. A further 14.4% answered that they did not oppose or support the attack. 83.1% of Palestinians living in the West Bank supported the attack to either an extreme or somewhat extreme. 75% of respondents agreed with the October 7th attack to any extent, and only 20.9% of Palestinians living in Gaza and 6.9% of Palestinians in the West Bank opposed the attack to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of seen these statistics that lean very heavily in the fact that they are in support of this. And I think we saw the beginning of that when Hamas was overwhelmingly elected into office in the first place. You know what I mean? When they overturned it and they had the mass support with people understanding that their charter clearly said that they wanted to wipe out Israel and all of the Israelis, you know what I mean? And that was kind of one of their campaign sort of targets. So I think Palestinians knowingly brought that sort of mentality into power. Sadly, they have not had a re-election since because Hamas will never want to let go of that control. And so,
but culturally, they've sustained that attitude.
Yeah, they have, but that's also been propagated by Hamas, and that starts at a very young age of indoctrination. I mean, we've seen that in even UN-supported education things. You've seen several people going on and discussing that, the fact that indoctrination happens at a very young age with the education materials that are found in schools and young schools in Gaza. And I think there's clear evidence that the Palestinians are in full support of this. After the October 7th attacks, 98% felt more proud to be Palestinian. And that is according to a survey from Birzeit University's Arab World for Research and Development, ALRAD. So I think we can establish that there's a different dynamic here than we're used to actually seeing. I think even if you go back to World War II, I think, even when German soldiers were committing atrocities against Israelis, there was a very well-known morale problem. And the German soldiers were going and they were getting drunk every night because they knew that this wasn't the right thing to do. And I think the difference that you're actually seeing with this is that there is no remorse on the Palestinian side. And that is something I think is very hard for people to comprehend, is that, from footage, horrific footage and photos that we've actually seen and video clips of Palestinians gleefully declaring that, that they are murdering Israeli families. There's a massive difference there, because there isn't remorse. And I think it's a horrible thing to say. And I'm actually talking about, the extremists that are under Hamas that are committing these atrocities. I'm not talking about everyday, Palestinians, even though there is a large support for this to happen against Israel. I think we need to be clear. It's the people that are committing these atrocities that are in this, extreme sort of mindset. But I think the large majority of Gazans, and I think it's important to establish that, because I think the mentality is slightly different in the West Bank than it is in Gaza. And I think Gazans in particular seem to agree with all of this and agree with the atrocities. And I think one of the things that we have a hard time, I think, and a Western mentality is comprehending that, is the comprehension of a radicalized hate. And I think that is very difficult to swallow. And I think people don't know really what to do with that, is that there is a very different mindset at play here. This is not a previously Western conflict like we saw in Western Europe during World War II. This is, there is a mass radicalization here that wants the extinction of another race, but from their core, like from an early age of indoctrination, because I think they don't know any better. And that is part of the radicalization mentality. And I think it is important for us to understand that, this is starting at a very young age, and you have an entire generation that knows nothing different other than hatred towards their neighbors. You can see it in the survey facts. You can see it in the numbers that you actually just talked about. And that is a massive blockade to creating dialogue and peace. This is a massive blockade in this two-state solution.
There's no difference really between Palestinian men and women when it comes to supporting the October the 7th attack. Men supported the attack, it was like 75.2%, which was only slightly higher than women at 74.9%. But you could say that this November the 14th poll is a result of the bombardment that Gaza is now subjected to. However, even earlier in June 2023, the Palestinian Center for Policy Survey Research conducted a survey revealing that 79% of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and 66% in the West Bank favor forming armed groups such as Lion's Den and the Jenin Battalion to strike at Israel. Furthermore, more than 85% of the respondents said that the PA does not have the right to arrest members of armed groups to prevent them from carrying out attacks against Israel. Now, they know that these groups have genocidal intentions, and this was echoed by the Birzeit University poll that found over 80% supporting the various terrorist organizations. Islamic Jihad received 84% support. Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade received 80%, Al-Qassam Brigade received 89%, and Hamas as a whole received 76%. You're talking about an overwhelming majority that subscribe to jihad, really.
It's important for us to take into context when these polls were taken, because it's, of course, they're going to support it when they're being bombarded by the Israelis. I mean, that's a clear, definitive line in where your ideology.
But even in June, prior to that.
Yeah, but this has been happening for a long time. This has been a slow turnover of the majority. This is what we, again, call mass radicalization by Hamas, which we should not forget that the Gazans elected and put into place and put into power, knowing what their charter was, knowing what their goals were, and things of that nature. This is not a surprise to anyone. I think there's so many issues here, you know what I mean, of the corruption of Hamas, taking all of the aid money for themselves, not supporting and building infrastructure for the people, keeping them uneducated so that they're easily radicalized and they're easily convinced. But then there's a lot of innocent people that are being caught in the middle of this as collateral damage. You've got thousands of displaced Palestinians. You have thousands of dead Palestinians in this. And, the agenda for Hamas is, I think, largely to gain support. They know that they're not going to come to a military victory victory on this, but it is largely to gain support for their cause.
Not support, but to maintain control. Now, people say, okay, this is Hamas's indoctrination, however, and therefore the Biden administration advocates revitalized PA that should rule Gaza the day after. But again, that's offering the false prescription to this phenomena, because the PA has also fostered a culture of radicalization. Abbas has had his pay for slay scheme, martyrdom scheme, whereby the Palestinian Authority have raised money for the families of suicide bombers. The PA initially refused to condemn the October the 7th massacre. Its foreign minister claimed on November the 19th that Israel fabricated evidence of slaughter by Hamas to justify its attack on Gaza. And then subsequently, the PA shifted gear to claim in a document sent to the UN that Israeli helicopters bombed the civilians at the music festival because they wanted to gain support for themselves, right?
Look, the propaganda machine is in full swing. Let's not fool ourselves. You know what I mean? But to be fair, it's in full swing on both sides. I think
But Israel does not justify the killing of civilians. Israel does not target civilians. Now, Abbas himself justified the massacres on October the 7th. He justified it saying this was a result of the Palestinian right to self-defense, right? And he called Israel's counterattack Israeli escalation against our people. The Prime Minister, Mohammed Shtayyeh, his response was to call it a natural result of Israel's crimes.
I mean, there's a laundry list of things. I mean, this goes back to our part 1 series when we were speaking with Dr. Vera, is that Israel has lost a lot of its credibility because it's over-exaggerated the truth or flat out denied things various, and they've lost their credibility with the public and with the press and with the media. We know that Hamas has openly lied and said things, and we know that their propaganda machine is also in full swing and just touting absolute fabrications. We do know that, but neither party has been very successful in getting credibility. Do you know what I mean? One obviously worse than the other, but either way, they have both just lost credibility on all of this. And now it's very difficult for anyone to determine who is lying, who isn't lying, what they're saying. You know, there's been a lot of rhetoric. There's been a lot of very heavy radicalization going on there from Hamas and Hamas supporters. And I think it's clear we need to get rid of Hamas. But unfortunately, Hamas has bedded in like a tick into the civilian populations by design to create more collateral damage. Israel doesn't have a choice. It has to defend itself. So it's an incredibly complicated, difficult position. It is a recognized terrorist organization and generally would have the support of the world to get rid of it. And largely, it doesn't. It's bizarre.
But I think that we ought to recognize the fact that the Palestinian Authority shares exactly the same ideology. We do not find amongst the Palestinian population a moderating, liberal, pro-Western voice. I mean, when you did have in the past, you had Salam Fayyad, who was a World Bank technocrat, and he really genuinely cared about Palestinian economic prosperity, how to create the economic solutions for offering prospects for the average Palestinian. Now, he was the darling of the West, right? He only received something like 2% support because the cultural priority was not to better one's own existence, but was to really harden resistance. Genocide was the preferred alternative, as opposed to offering one's children's real prospects for bettering their lives.
We've kind of had these conversations that they could have built a Singapore and they chose not to. And a lot of things could have been done differently in this. But I think what most people, don't really fully understand is that there have been many, many opportunities where they have been offered an autonomous state. I mean, when they went in and spoke to Arafat and said, right, we will give you the West Bank, we will give you Gaza, we will give you the Arab portions of Jerusalem for you to control, we'll give you all the infrastructure that's there and $30 billion. He just got up and walked away from the table without even a counteroffer. This isn't, I think for those that are in power in the Palestinian territories, this is not necessarily about a land grab. I think it is about regaining everything. And
but that to regain everything entails genocide. When they say from the river to the sea, it entails genocide. I remember reading in Bill Clinton's autobiography that when he was leaving office, Arafat contacted him and he said to Mr. President, "You're a great man." And Bill Clinton responded to him, "No, I'm a fool, and you made me one." Right? And that kind of story, it epitomizes the fact that the West thinks in terms of constructive materialist solutions, whereas in the Middle East, that's just not a value. The money, the territory, it's not a value. And I think in the West, we keep failing to see that. I remember seeing a long time ago this documentary called The Fog of War about former US Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, when he meets Castro decades after the Bay of Pigs crisis, and Castro reveals to him that he was willing to undergo nuclear annihilation in Cuba, but it was Khrushchev that held him back. And Robert McNamara is just aghast at this, the fact that somebody's willing to embrace national suicide. And that's a policy option. And I think that in the West, we don't have the adequate tools in our policy kit to contend with that, because if we threaten them with military action or death, that's an inducement for them, right? If we offer them economic incentives, that's a disincentive for them. So we actually don't know how to contend with a genocidal ideology that threatens our existence. We just don't have those tools.
And yeah, because I think it's so far removed from our vernacular, from our thought process, that it's hard to comprehend that, which is why I said it's very difficult for people to understand that the ideology is just of pure radicalization and hate. And it's not about land grabs. It's not about anything. It is about the removal of an entire population of people from Earth. And I think people really find that difficult to believe, and they find it incomprehensible. And that is what this kind of extreme radicalization has done to the mindset of a lot of large swathes of population in Gaza. Less so in the West Bank, but it is still there according to the numbers, but it's hard to comprehend. But I think we need to find out how we got here in the first place and how that radicalization took place. So I think it's probably a great time to bring on our special guest, Dr. Eran Lerman, former Deputy Director for Foreign Policy and International Affairs at the Israeli National Security Council and Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security.
Eran, it's a pleasure having you here today. Thank you so much for joining us. I wanted to ask you, how does something that's overlooked often in this conflict, it's often viewed as a territorial conflict, it's often viewed as just merely asymmetric conflict, but ideology does inform the conflict enormously because of Hamas's charter. And I was just wondering how the ideology itself is influencing the way the current conflict in Gaza is being fought, because obviously the way the conflict is fought also spills over to the day after, to the reconstruction.
And the de-radicalization of Gaza, which would be absolutely vital for the future of its own people.
By the way, sorry, one thing that you can also address later on is that often when people like General Petraeus or McChrystal speak about the surge or counterinsurgency, there was a winning hearts and minds component that the US had in order to de-radicalize. And that's something that Israel doesn't seem to have. Israel is fantastic, perhaps operationally, tactically, technologically, but it bemoans the fact that there is this degree of genocidal radicalism. However, it doesn't appear to have a mechanism to project a counter-narrative.
You're right, and this is why I believe that elements of the international community in the form of an international authority, transitional international authority, would need to carry that burden. The UN certainly cannot, because our experience with UNRWA has been that it became a promoter of hate and radicalization rather than a de-radicalization agency. So we need something very different to inform the future. I would say this, in a very general sense. People who assume that Palestinians, generally people in Gaza specifically, are incapable of understanding cause and effect, and incapable of understanding what sober people in the Arab world, and I've seen some very scathing essays from the Emirates in Morocco and elsewhere, what they are able to see is that Hamas has brought a catastrophe upon the Palestinian people of Gaza. The assumption that the Gazans themselves are benighted children who cannot understand cause and effect is in itself a sort of a racism of reduced expectations. I believe that once the full implications of what Hamas did on the 7th of October are brought to bear, I think there will be young people coming up saying we need a very different perspective, a very different approach. This has happened elsewhere in history, where countries were awash with an extremely powerful ideological imperative and then faced with the full consequences of a catastrophic defeat, went 180 degrees around. It's symbolic, perhaps, that we saw the commander of the German Air Force donating blood in Israel during this conflict. It tells you that de-radicalization and the dismantling of a totalitarian mindset is not an impossibility in human affairs. And anyone who says, well, but the Palestinians are not Germans, is sort of making a racist statement, if I may say, indirectly. But let me go back to the roots of Islamism and where Hamas comes from. You see, it is not a Palestinian national movement. It is a Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood in itself is a product of the late 20s, early 30s of the 20th century in the most direct sense. That is to say, it is not just religion or a version of religion. It is a specific perversion of religion which turns Islam into essentially another model, another template of modern revolutionary totalitarianism. And you can see the direct imprint of what was then the rising new nations. I'm quoting Hassan al-Banna, writing in the early 30s, the rising new nations that rose from misery and disaster. Italy, Soviet Union, of course, from the collapse of Tsarist Russia, and Nazi Germany rising from defeat to overwhelming power in Europe. These were the totalitarian models around which people like Hassan al-Banna in Egypt, Maulana Abul Ala al-Maududi in India, and others, what we call today the founders of modern Islamism, basically remodeled their faith, their religion, around emulation of these totalitarian models. True, this was now to be the totalitarianism of the Islamic Ummah, not of race and blood nation as in the fascist model, or of class struggle in the Bolshevik model, but this was to be a variation on the same theme, an Islamic variation on the theme of totalitarianism. This is where Hamas comes from. When you read the Hamas covenant, for example, and people should, you find that, for example, its Article 22 is essentially the Nazi interpretation of history. It basically tells you that everything that happened in modern history, from the French Revolution in 1789 to the collapse or near collapse of the Soviet Union, was in essence a Jewish conspiracy. I say Jewish, although they sometimes refer to the Zionists, but I would infer that it must have been beyond the capacity of Theodor Herzl to plan the French Revolution, since he was born in 1860 and this was 1789. In other words, it's the Jews. It's the Nazi story about how the Jews destroyed the world, led to World War I and World War II, and the creation of the League of Nations and the creation of the United Nations. What a mistake from our point of view. But basically everything that you see around you is a Zionist Jewish conspiracy. That's Nazi stuff.
Eran, I want to ask you, the irony of the state of Israel is that when the Jewish people didn't have an independent state and they were vulnerable in shtetls in Eastern Europe and subjected to pogroms culminating in the Holocaust in the 20th century, the Jewish people could identify threats plainly and clearly as anti-Semitic, whereas a sovereign Jewish state reframes it as being territorial, socio-economic, nationalistic aspirations, and 19th/20th century slaughter took place in a 21st century sovereign Jewish state. And Israel had known for over a decade that Hamas was building a whole tunnel network, and it didn't intervene. So it's like, I would say that you were to blame for reframing this ideological threat and conducting intellectual acrobatics at your own expense.
Well, it's a fair accusation, but let me clarify how things went. First of all, as to the tunnels, what concerned us was not so much where they would hide in a war, but rather where they would penetrate Israel. And this is why in the fighting in 2014, which we call Operation Protective Edge, the penetrating tunnels, IDF forces went in, because at the time there was no other way to detect tunnels underground. It's soft alluvial grounds. The only way was to go into Gaza, based on good intelligence, locate the entrance points and destroy them from the entrance outwards. And essentially that threat was dealt with at the time. And later, technology was developed to actually detect and destroy the tunnels. And a barrier was built, sunk into the ground around the Gaza Strip, which neutralized the tunnel threat. And the fact is that in this massive incursion into Israel, no tunnel was effectively used. There was no underground penetration into Israel. They came overground, they came by glider, they broke the fences, they landed by sea, not very successfully around Zikim, but basically there was no penetration. And the assumption was, we've solved this problem, we locked them out of our own territory. And the idea that they can actually use a series of interlocking mistakes in the conduct of the collection agency work, for example, that 3 of the reconnaissance balloons were down on that Black Saturday, and they had other indications that this is their opportunity. All of this did not occur to people. And I've seen a heartbreaking interview with a major general in the Israeli Southern Command who lives in Be'eri and lost his mother. And he says, I fully subscribe to this misconception that we have an impenetrable border. But beyond that, there was the larger question, and you are right, that whether or not Hamas was being kind of domesticated, because for the last 16 years, since they took over violently over the control of the Gaza Strip, they have been a government of sorts. So they were responsible for the well-being and the economic interests and so on of the people under their rule. And the underlying assumption was that rationally, they would modify their conduct in order to create the conditions for their people to have a better life, because that's what is normally expected of governments wherever governments are. Turns out that for the core group of Hamas leaders, governance meant nothing. Their purpose remained the ideological commitment, first of all, to kill Jews and demoralize Israel, and to try and set the entire region in flames by basically provoking Israel into the kind of action that would lead to the intervention by the rest of the Arab world and Iran and everyone else, and this will become a fight to the finish. Well, they did manage to gain a remarkable tactical success. But they made, I would say, three mistakes. One is that by acting in the most brutal way imaginable, they united Israel to an unimaginable level. And the assumption that Israeli society is fragile turned out to be dead wrong. We may not have the best government in the world, we have a very good people. And you saw the effects. Secondly, the immensity of their crimes mobilized much of the leadership, at least, of the civilized world, leaving aside, forgive my language, useful idiots on Western campuses, and of course, Muslim minorities mobilizing for the Palestinians in various places. But if you look at the actual response of the American government, the German government, and others, they basically understood that given the enormity of what happened on October 7th, Israel has no choice but to dismantle Hamas rule in Gaza. And the third mistake was the assumption that the Arab world would mobilize against Israel and go to war, which not even the Iranians are willing to do. Not even Hassan Nasrallah is willing to do beyond a certain low threshold of mid-intensity conflict. And perhaps the final mistake, which I should add to this list, is the assumption that the IDF would quickly be bogged down and killed in high numbers, and the Israeli willingness to carry the campaign forward would collapse. Now, in Israel, we mourn every soldier. The family is on television, and the funeral is on television, and the sense of personal loss of all of us is acute for each and every one of the 50 or more soldiers who already fell in the ground incursion in Gaza. But these are much lower numbers than anyone expected. And the reason is that while the Hamas is fighting a two or one-dimensional war on the ground and very, very often literally with a tunnel vision, the IDF is fighting a three-dimensional war, which involves the ground forces, 2 dimensions, and the air force, and all of them glued together by very accurate combat intelligence. The intelligence service took a terrible shock on October 7th, but recuperated very impressively in terms of support for operations. So,
Eran, to that point, I actually have 2 questions to ask you on 2 of the points that you mentioned. But, you made a comment earlier about how in one of their miscalculations, it was the fact that they didn't think the international community leadership would come to the aid of Israel and back and support them. But then you also made the comment about the, leaving aside the useful idiots. And that leads me to my question about the information battle space. And you have a large international media, you have social media now, you have this galvanization of pro-Palestinian sentiment that seems to be echoing through the world. And Israel seems to be losing the informational battle space. And I think the Western forces have faced this before. When we were in Iraq and Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda and ISIS were able to get information out very, very quickly. Most of it untrue, but they were able to get information out very, very quickly. And I understand that the West is bound by truth. But it seems that, Israel, the West, when we're confronted with the informational battle space, is that we're behind our enemies considerably, and Israel is losing that battle. What do you actually think that can be done to start gaining traction back on that? Because the sentiment seems to be very much from a media global perspective in the Palestinian Gaza cause.
It's a famous saying that a lie can circle around the world before truth has put its shoes on. We could also lie, but we cannot, given the nature of our own societies. What we can do is actually retroactively prove, and that has been the case, for example, in Al Ahli Hospital in Gaza, that what our challengers are saying is a lie. And in this case, as you may recall, Hamas put it out that hundreds were killed. First of all, dozens were killed. And this was an Israeli airstrike. Turns out to have been a Palestinian Islamic jihad. So you can take this kind of story, or you can take the evidence we now have at Shifa Hospital and other hospitals being used militarily and even for holding hostages and that this kind of information can be used to, let's say, raise doubts about the veracity of what the other side is saying.
Just to interrupt you quickly, I think my point to that is exactly what you've just said, is that it seems that Western forces, including Israel now, seem to be reactive in things. And in a clickbait society, people are only interested, they see the headlines, and then we've lost the news cycle. We're always behind. And we spoke to a guest earlier who was talking about one of the innovations that the Israel military forces have developed that should be studied and incorporated into other militaries was the incorporation of intelligence within units. And I'm wondering, does it not serve you to do the same with information officers who are pumping out information of what's happening prior to and going on an offensive rather than defensive mode for information operations? Because it is so important today in an age of communication that it's not just about kinetic warfare. So I'm just wondering where you sit on that and what your thoughts may be on that.
Well, here and there, things are being done. Our IDF spokesman actually went with a raiding party under Rantisi Hospital and pointed to evidence of hostages having been held there and military equipment being there. Again, in a world of fake news, anyone can say that even the horrifying Hamas-produced visual evidence of the crimes of October 7th are also generated by AI or fake news. And where's the evidence? So I think we had this from the Queen of Jordan. So somebody actually bothered to send her on her email, I think, a few clips that disprove her assertions. This is also why Israel is selectively showing to decision makers around the world the edited film of various Hamas recordings that Hamas has since realized the magnitude of their mistakes and started pulling them off of the air, but they are there when we have them, Hamas recording their own atrocities with glee. And to show this on the wider public media would dishonor and the dead.
But I would have to, though, respond to that is that you then are causing a gap to emerge between the political leaders of Western states and their public. So, for example, in England, the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, Labour councillors are leaving, front benchers have resigned. He's facing enormous pressure because he knows he is going to lose key constituencies, and the US is exactly the same. Biden may lose key states. And
I doubt it.
All the progressives.
I doubt it. Frankly, I can't see the Arabs in the United States voting for a man who plans to throw all of them out along with the Mexicans. Or facilitating his victory. But that's, I think, between now and November, there's an ocean of developments awaiting us. But clearly, there's nothing we can do to persuade people who think Israel's existence is wrong. I don't know, Susan Sarandon, or 75 years of war, that our existence is a crime. At that point, there's no argument left anymore. I somehow think I have a right to exist, and I'm not going to find myself in a conversation with somebody who thinks we are not. So all we can do is influence the space in between our committed supporters, and there are many, and our committed enemies, which are also not insignificant. But there's still a very wide space in the middle where we have some work to do. And I'm doing it now, reminding people of what Hamas is, where they come from, what is their source of inspiration, what are their purposes.
Eran, initially I asked you about how the ideology is impacting on the way the war is actually fought. The Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research in June 2023 produced a survey that revealed that 79% of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and 66% in the West Bank favor forming armed groups such as Lion's Den and the Jenin Battalion to strike at Israel. Furthermore, more than 85% of the respondents said that the Palestinian Authority does not have the right to arrest members of the armed groups to prevent them from carrying out attacks against Israel. Now, in response to this, Israel's president, Isaac Herzog, declared that we have to understand that Hamas has built a machine of evil right at our doorstep. It is an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true, this rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved. It's absolutely not true. They could have risen up. They could have fought against that evil regime which took over Gaza in a coup d'etat, murdering their family members. And this was also echoed by Israel's former national security advisor, Giora Eiland, who commented that Americans speak of Gaza as though there is Hamas bad people and civilians in Gaza who are innocent and need to be saved. This is not the reality in Gaza. Gaza, to a very great extent, is a Nazi state in which they have managed to recruit the entire civil society in support of the struggle against Israel. Every other home in Gaza has an entrance down to the tunnels below. These are private homes. All the hospital and school administrators are Hamas workers. There is a great effort by all Gazans against Israel. They are united around their leadership, not opposed to the leadership. Now, when you look at these statistics and you look at that narrative, is it fair to distinguish between civilians and combatants? And what is the prospect of successfully reconstructing Gaza when the entire society is geared towards your destruction?
Well, as I said, my one hope rests in the assumption that even Gazans, for all that they've been indoctrinated to think over the last 16 years, or if you wish, under the PA is not much better when it comes to the legitimacy of Israel or to the attitude towards Jews. You remember that Abu Mazen just recently went back to a rant against Jews in Europe being responsible for what the catastrophe that befell them and so on. Typical problem was not only with Hamas. Having said all this, the capacity to understand cause and effect is an essential, I would say, the basis of human rationality. And if they've not lost their rationality altogether, they are bound to understand at some point that it is Hamas and its policy that brought this upon them. And you hear this here and there, you begin to hear the murmur. How come Hamas is sitting in the tunnels when we are exposed above the tunnels? How come they have drawn us into this abyss? And it will take time. This is not a mindset that can change overnight. But using Giora's own image of a Nazi state, we have to remember the Germans fought for Hitler's state almost to the very last. There was no attempt at any level to accept these few white rose heroes. There was no attempt to overthrow Hitler, even when it was absolutely clear that the war is being lost. But in retrospect, the German people woke up to the reality that the kind of ideology that they voted for in 1933 and fought for basically brought a catastrophe upon them, equivalent to what we are seeing now in Gaza, although let's keep things in proportion. This is not Dresden. The physical destruction may look similar, but people have been asked to and did move out of the battle zones, which, as Grand Chap said, this is not a privilege Britain gave to the citizens of Dresden during the war. So when they wake up to the full reality of what befell them as a result of Hamas decisions, we may finally come to a point where perhaps a new leadership will emerge that understands these things. You know, even Abu Mazen, for all his faults, wrote a piece in 2002 when Arafat dragged the Palestinians into the violent campaign that people mistakenly call the Second Intifada, which was not an intifada at all. It was not an uprising. It was a terror campaign organized from above. But Abu Mazen wrote a short essay, which he called Huzimna, we have been defeated, by which he actually meant we have defeated ourselves. We have brought this disaster upon our own heads. And once that kind of logic kicks in, we may have a chance of seeing a different reality in Gaza. But it is a long transition, and I believe not a transition that Israel should manage, and actually also not a transition that the Palestinian Authority should manage, for the simple reasons that they cannot manage it. They are a deeply corrupt and dysfunctional government, and for them to try and handle the immense challenge of reconstruction in Gaza is simply to set them up for failure, regardless of maybe our ideological concerns. So if we don't want this to be Israel, and it cannot be the PA, and I doubt if any Arab country would volunteer for duty, we need the international community to start thinking about a viable alternative for a transition period.
Eran, you mentioned earlier that on October 7th, at the beginning of this war, that Israel had a major intelligence failure. And I think that the following days preceding it, speaking to several Israelis, I think that was their biggest question. How did this happen? We have hundreds of people glued to monitors, monitoring every inch of the fences and ground sensors and a myriad other things that could have detected this. What went wrong? How did this even happen? How were they allowed to breach the wall in the first place?
Well, what actually happened is that what we did not anticipate is that through simple means, some of them learned, by the way, from lessons, Iranian and other lessons in the war in Ukraine, they disabled the monitoring system using small drones, basically. It was hand grenades or small explosive devices, and blinded the front line of monitoring. First of all, of course, they did prepare very quietly and for a long time for this massive incursion and mobilize people in the middle of the night. And there was a certain sense that something is happening because the divisional command had a consultation. The Shin Bet sent its elite unit to the front lines on the assumption that something may be happening later on the day or later in the morning. But the timing at 6:30 in the morning actually caught everyone by surprise. There were brilliant tactical solutions that they had to some of our most sophisticated systems. And then once they broke through, they went directly to the command structure in the area, the Gaza division, and to the bases, the quarters of the young women, basically, who were monitoring the cameras, and slaughtered them. Raped, murdered, slaughtered, or took them captive. And by then the breach was wide open. The deeper result for this is that the IDF has been, let's say, cutting down on its ground footprint for a very long time now. There was too much reliance on technological solutions. Technological solutions are brilliant. Iron Dome and the Arrow have proved themselves remarkably in this war. Our level of civilian casualties in the rear is minimal. The integration of Air Force intelligence and combat troops in the ground incursion is, I think, will be studied for years to come. But nevertheless, the reliance on a technological solution to keep the border safe proved to be disastrously misplaced on the 7th of October, and the rest will need to be handled by a systemic national inquiry once the fighting ends.
Thank you so much, Eran. I really appreciate you joining us and your insights and everything we've discussed today. I think it's incredibly important for people to understand and to realize the mindset where Hamas has come from, its foundings, and what its actual charter really is.
Thank you for having me, and I hope this is useful for people who need to understand what is at stake.
Thank you so much, Eran. This ideological component is often really overlooked, and I think it needs to be brought back to the forefront. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And that brings us into our third segment of the show of What This Means to You, the real world outcomes and who this affects in everyday life, Western world, and the Middle East.
There's a misconception that the conflict in Gaza is spilling out towards the region. I think that the equation should be reversed. It's Iran that is sponsoring this, and Iran is the source for not only Hamas's radicalization in Gaza, but also Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis from Yemen that are all striking now, not only at Israel, but at shipping lanes in the Red Sea, which is causing ships to have to circumvent to go via Africa. So it's adding 3 weeks onto the journey, and shipping prices are going up exponentially as a result of this, and it can have a real effect on the global economy. So it's not that we need to resolve the Israeli-Hamas conflict in order to quell regional tensions. What's happening in Gaza is a symptom, not a cause of what Iran is doing. So Iran has conducted hundreds of attacks against US personnel and bases across the region since October the 7th. It has unleashed its proxies in Iraq, its proxies in Yemen, its proxies in Lebanon, its proxies in Gaza, and its cells pose a threat in the West itself. So I think that there has been an uptick in international risk, and the Biden administration is still attempting to localize the conflict, all the while Iran is attempting to broaden and regionalize the conflict. So the Biden administration still does not want to say that Iran is sponsoring or supporting or galvanizing the Houthis. So they're making these artificial distinctions in order to make policy more manageable. But in the process, they are contributing to the regional risk and insecurity.
To bring it home even more, to your point on the fact of what's happening in the Red Sea is, creating massive shipping delays, massive increase in shipping, adding 3 weeks on. It's much more in much cases. And that's not just affecting the Western world. That's affecting, supply chains everywhere. I mean, we've seen it here in the Middle East. For those of you that don't know, I'm based in the UAE, and Barack is sitting in lovely, sunny London at the moment. But, it has affected supply chains here. It's like anytime you order something, in stores, they can't get supplies. We're seeing, disruption in things across the retail sector, across the board here in the Middle East. The same as in the US, the same as in Europe, getting parts for various different things, different clothing, retail. I mean, just across the board, it has really had a knock-on effect on the supply chain and the retail industry. And that affects economies. When people want something, they want to buy something now, they can't get it. They can't get it for 3 weeks, 6 months. This causes real difficulty and real strain on small business owners, on retail shops, on consumers. So this really does have a real world effect. And I don't think that people make the connection between the two. That's why this is happening. And this is why there's a delay.
But, they ought to be making that connection now, because this is the error that the just-in-time supply chains that was created during that glorious period of globalization, where we thought that it was the end of history. US had achieved primacy. It had beaten the Soviet Union. There were no geopolitical competitors as there are now. They thought that China could be co-opted, so they created a just-in-time supply chain that was very, very lean, and COVID disrupted that. Lockdown disrupted that completely. That's the first wave of disruption that the supply chains underwent. And now, it underwent a second supply. The energy supply chains were disrupted when Russia invaded Ukraine, and Russia sought to hold the West hostage with energy prices. And then subsequently now you're seeing shipping lanes being targeted and maritime security being really undermined. So everything impacts supply chains, and we now need to increase prices rather, in order to create some redundancy in our supply chain. We can't afford for it to be lean anymore. It needs to be more resilient. And the way to make it more resilient is to perhaps cause greater onshoring, greater regionalization, and increase prices for it to actually travel a much longer route.
I think we all just need to win the lottery and call it a day. and then I'm exiting humanity. I'm moving to an island, and that's it. I'm calling it a day.
And then even in the island, you're going to be threatened by rising water levels. So global warming won't give you respite even in your island.
Most days I'd rather deal with Mother Nature than people, I think. But then we'd be out of a podcast. There'd be nothing to talk about. I'd be talking about, my latest coconut harvest on my island.
we'd be talking about why Mother Nature is such a bitch.
Oh my God, we can't put that on the podcast. 100%. I'm having to bleep that out a million times.
Not. You've got to keep that in.
Definitely bleeping it. Oh my goodness. I can't take you anywhere, Brock. You know what I mean? It's like it's constantly having to sanitize you everywhere we go.
Yeah, it sanitized me because I am the voice of deeper sanity.
On that delusional note, we will move into our last and final segment, which is equally delusional, which is the Godfather characters. So who's who in the zoo today? Who's who in the Godfather? Tell us all the intricate details.
Look, this is why the Godfather is so unique, and that it encapsulates all of reality as we know it. And there's a scene in The Godfather Part 2 where Michael Corleone goes to Cuba and he witnesses one of the Cuban rebels basically committing suicide and taking one of the policemen with him in the process. And he observes that. And later at Hyman Roth's birthday party, he raises that issue. And Hyman Roth says to him, "What does that tell you?" See, he says, "It tells me that they can win." And I think that when you have both a genocidal and suicidal adversary, we don't know how to contend with that. Liberal democracies have not developed the tools to be versatile and multifaceted. We don't know, on one hand, how to be liberal in our home populations, while at the same time be coercive abroad to populations that seek to annihilate us. We just do not know how to deal with that. And policymakers haven't even begun addressing this. And the number of people that mean us ill will are just growing at an exponential rate. So on one hand, they're radical to begin with. On the other hand, they're radicalized as a result of a military response. So it's a lose-lose situation. And Western democracies have not begun to formulate a strategic plan in how to contend and beat such adversaries. It's alien to our lexicon. It's alien to our psyches.
Hence why I'm moving to an island. That's all I can say. However, I'm going to be more specific this time, because the last time I said I wanted to move to an island, I ended up moving to the UK. So I need to be more specific on what type of island I'm moving to, like a tropical paradise island. Do you know what I mean? Because next time I'll probably end up in like Long Island. Do you know?
If you find yourself in a tropical one, you'll probably find me there, sort of disturbing your peace and just harassing you just by my mere presence.
If I go to an island, I'm not telling you where it is, Brock. Okay, well, that's it for us today. Please make sure to tune in next week for our episode on the war in Israel, Part 4, the conflict overview in Israel and what this means for global economies and its everyday impact on you. Until next time, we'll see you later. The Geo-Godfather Wars is an Electrocast production. Our executive producers are Leah Tedrow, Barak Seener, Mark Netter, and Peter Rafelson. If you like our podcast, please rate, review, and tell your friends and colleagues to listen in.
Hey there, fabulous souls. I'm Stephanie Baklaan.
And I'm Eden Alpert.
And we're the hosts of the brand new podcast, Unapologetically Fab.
Get ready to join us on an amazing and real journey as we dive into life after 40 and own it.
We're all about changing the narrative, leaning into who you are, and living a life by your own design.
Join us as we embrace life unapologetically and redefine success.
This is Unapologetically Fab,
An Electric Cat production.
See you there.
Electricast. Electricast.
Welcome to the Candle Power Hour. Come with us backstage behind the scenes of show business spanning over 4 decades and bringing you the experiences that can only be told by the people who were there.
Our guests are from the A-list, the F-list, and everyone in between. Get set for some of the most insane, hilarious, and inspiring stories you will ever hear.
I'm Mercury.
And I'm Diego.
Your hosts for
The Candle Power Hour.
Electricast.